Our first presenter likely doesn't need much intro for most people. Dr. Mike Tokach is a university distinguished professor, swine nutritionist, and extension specialist at Kansas State University. He has a PhD from the University of Minnesota and over 30 years of experience conducting field research in the swine industry. I've had the opportunity to work with Mike at Holden Farms, and I couldn't think of anybody better to cover this topic to kick us off. So with that, we'll turn it over to Mike.
All right, thank you, Matt. All right. Well, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be at Leman Conference again, visiting with you. And then I got asked by Matt to talk about the evolution of swine production research. And it's a little interesting for me, as I'm usually up that want to give hardcore data results from trials and experiences. And so this one's a little different for me. I'm going to give you a little more of history and talk about where we've come from in swine production research and how things have changed some over the years. I was fortunate to be able to give a presentation here about 14 years ago about where research was headed, and I think it's really kept moving along that evolution that I talked about at that time, about moving from a lot of production research being done at the university level to being done in commercial production systems. And so what I'm going to talk about today is what's changed and what hasn't changed about swine production research. And obviously we've had a lot of things that have changed over the years, and we'll spend a little bit of time going through those and then finish up with some of the key points that we want to think about that haven't changed. So first, when we think about what has changed, it's where is that research being done? And what I mean by this is the production research that is being applied, the practical applied stuff that is going on the farm. These are research systems in the United States that I tried to summarize up. And I've got 2010 because that's the last time I gave that presentation where I summarized what I knew was going on in terms of production research systems. So back in 1990, close when I was finishing up with my PhD, there were two systems in the United States that I'm aware of that had swine production research facilities. Holden Farms happened to be one of them at the time. They were very early in doing production research in their system. There were some feed companies certainly that had production research facilities, but in terms of where most of the production research was being done, or the applied research, was at the university level at that time. And there were about 35 universities that were doing what I would consider pretty applied research. In 2010, there were still about 28 universities that had at least one person actively involved in applied research. But production systems, we at that time had 18 production systems that I knew of that had some kind of research program. Today, that's increased up to where at least I know of at least 28 production systems that have an active research program of one sort or another. And that's mostly, when I count that number, is some type of finishing or nursery research facility in a fairly big way. And on the university side, the number that are doing applied research continues to go down. There's about 13 universities today that have again, at least one faculty member that's actively doing production type research in the US. So the size of the research facilities also is something that obviously has changed. In 1990, most of the university research facilities were 24 to 30 pens in a room, and 4 to 6 pigs in a pen was fairly typical. In production, those two research facilities I talked about, those were 24 to 30 pen type facilities, and there were 15 to 24 pigs per pen as the size of those facilities. So you had to be relatively, a few number of treatments that you were testing, and you had to replicate in order to try to find differences. And as I'll talk about, you were looking for very large differences compared to what we are today. And now in 2024, the university facilities, they're all over the board yet, but we have a number of university facilities now that are 60 to 80 pens in a room to be able to get a lot more replication. 4 to 10 pigs per pen, still relatively small pen sizes in most university facilities. On the production side, they range anywhere from about 48 to 144 pens in a facility with anywhere from 25 to 60 pigs per pen. So you can see the size and the number of replications continues to grow in those facilities in order to get the replication required. So that mentioned the size of the response that you're looking for. One of the very first trials that we did in 1990 when I finished up with school and working with one of the production systems was a genetic study. That genetic study, we found the differences between the two genetic lines that they were using was $20 a pig. So it didn't take a lot of replications to find that size of a difference. But now, today, we're looking for differences that are most of the time $1 to $2 the most between genetic lines when we're doing these studies, looking at sire lines or maternal lines out in the field. And feed additive responses. A lot of our trials in the field early on, a lot of the antibiotic type studies that were done, we were getting anywhere from 5 to 20% responses to antibiotics. And so you could find those responses with a lot fewer replications. Now we're looking for 1.5 to 2% responses. We'd like to find even smaller sometimes and need even more replication if we're going to try to find these responses to a growth promotant that even when you do meta-analysis only gives 0.75 to a 1.5% type response. It takes a lot of replication to do that. Feed systems, we've seen a lot of evolution, and then obviously as a nutritionist, I think about the feed systems being extremely important in terms of understanding the feed efficiency side. The very first feed system that we use, here's just a gamut of them, very first feed system, and this is still being used in some production systems, is an Arcfeld drop system. If you haven't seen this type of a scale, it's a scale that hangs over the feeder, and it's manually dropped to drop the feed into the feeder in morning and afternoon, or once a day, depending on how number of pigs you have in that pen and you're feeding. It's a dial scale. If these are calibrated correctly, you can get very good data off of these type of systems. We did a lot of trials in these kind of systems. The one downside is that on a curtain-sided barn, it interferes with airflow quite a bit when you put these over the top of every feeder in that barn. And it's a lot of manual labor. That's the main reason people have moved away from them. More than the accuracy, it's the manual labor side. We moved, when the first research barn we put up, working with at the time Global Ventures, that then became New Horizon, now Hordes West, we put in the Mosdale feed cart. This was a system that was used in universities. It was used, Purdue had a Mosdale cart, and it was used to feed test station pigs in a number of test stations. And with small groups of pigs, it worked pretty well. We put this in a 1,200 head finisher. We learned really fast it doesn't work quite as well. And one of the things, the first turn of pigs, we wore out the flighting in the auger. It was just the amount of feed that went through that thing. So we rebuilt and had local machine shops built the homemade ones, and they lasted a lot longer. But the problem was just with 2 finishing barns at the time, it took 1 employee all day just to get those pigs fed with that kind of a system. So that didn't last very long for us. We moved then to the FeedLogic system, and that's still in use, obviously, in a lot of farms. The FeedLogic, what we've found in general is that if you're feeding 800 pigs or less, FeedLogic actually works pretty darn well. When you try to do 1,200 pigs, it's a little too many pigs to keep up on and to always keep up with this system. And that's where we run into trouble with it, is almost every barn that we have that we got 1,200 pigs or more, it has a lot of trouble. So we have a number of them that people have obviously moved to a big Touchman type system, and there's a number of these kind of systems out there now. You have the Bold system, the Big Dutchman, there's a Fast system, the Roxel. There's just a number of them that you can look at. These systems, again, similar to like with the FeedLogic, when it's working well, works fantastic. The biggest downside, I think, in these systems that I see in terms of the data that we run across is the solenoids, and keeping those solenoids from sticking open and keeping the air dry enough so you don't get the humidity and the condensation has been a problem in some of the barns with these Big Dutchman systems. So basically, my answer is I think we're moving more and more to these kind of systems, but none of these are perfect. They all have issues. They all have things that you need to work with, and it's understanding the system and figuring out which one that you are most comfortable with to get research done with. One of the other things that's changed is the variety of questions that are being asked. Really, some things haven't changed. We still look at growth performance in almost all of our studies, obviously, because of the economic importance of growth rate and feed efficiency. But the other areas where the larger facility size, the more creative designs have become important is to look at things like mortality, vices, cull percentages. When you start getting into these subpopulations, the responses in those small pigs as an example, you need lots and lots of replication because you're dealing with smaller and smaller population to start with. You know, the responses under health challenges, Aaron's going to talk about some of the approach that they're taking. We're seeing more production systems trying to figure out how do we look at health challenge situations and do research with those health challenge pigs in the field, because that's obviously a big question people have. You know, vaccines and intervention responses. You know, what happens to our intervention when we have a PRRS outbreak, or we have some kind of a unique situation that we can go in and test interventions. A lot of those kind of questions coming. On the sow side, I'm not going to talk quite as much about sow research, but obviously a lot of interest there, partly because we don't have as much field-type research facilities on the south side, so there's still more questions being asked. But really unique things starting to come out on the, I saw there was a paper yesterday about how many pigs can you put on over the teat count and successfully raise those pigs. What about crate size and things that we can't answer very easily in a university setting? What about drying pigs? You need a lot of pigs when you're looking at how are you going to reduce preweaning mortality. You know, University of Illinois, working with Mashov, has done a lot of nice work on drying pigs and subpopulations of pigs there, and whether it's done in the summertime or wintertime, and all those kinds of questions. And this is one that I think there's good and bad, is the speed of how fast research is being done today and how fast you can implement the response. That's different than what it used to be. I mean, we have, the good with this is we've got more field-type facilities, and so when you get results from a trial, and because these are in production systems, you often don't wait until it goes through a peer review, it goes through getting it out to your group of your Midwest Animal Science meetings or the vet meetings to get it in front of people, to shoot holes in it and get feedback on it continually. So sometimes it gets put into practice very quickly. There's good about that, because if it's a good practice that's going to make you money, it gets applied fast. But the downside is that it does have less peer review in many situations, and it's less likely to be tested by the early adopters. A lot of times, university research, when the trial's done, there'll be some early adopters that'll test that out and see, well, does it really work for them? And if it works for them, then it'll keep getting multiplied up. And if it doesn't work, it kind of falls to the wayside. And we see that sometimes is that some things can come out in a research project, get implemented, and then you get more research done. It's like, well, that wasn't quite as positive as that first trial showed. And so you got to take a couple steps back. And so there is some bad with how fast data can get implemented today. I think some systems I've seen that this has been really nice is they've adapted ways to conduct secondary larger scale studies. So if their research trial in their research barn shows that this is positive, then they'll put a number of barns on that particular, whether it be a product or a concept, or to test it out on a wider scale before doing full scale application across their entire production system. And I know there's a number of systems, especially if it's something that's going to be economically is going to cost some money to implement. We see more and more of that being done. So some of the things that had changed, well, what hasn't changed? And I'll talk about each of these, is the requirements for successful research. That we need to have creativity, there needs to be funding, you need to have the research mentality and commitment. The peer review, I'll talk about that. You said we don't get as much peer review in production research, but it's still important to have a mechanism within your systems to how do you get even internal peer review if you don't go out for external peer review with it. And then credibility you have to have for long-term sustainability of that system research. And of course, you can't do any of this without the quality people. That hasn't changed. If you don't have quality people in charge of the research program, in the barn, in charge of the day-to-day data collection, the research isn't worth very much, is what we've found that over and over, time and time again. So creativity, why is creativity needed? Well, you obviously need to understand where are the biggest opportunities in a production system for economic return to that system. And with that, you need to have a continual infusion of new ideas. And sometimes, especially if you have a good production system that doesn't turn over people very quickly, this can actually become an issue that they've got to kind of seek out some outside opinions, seek out some outside ideas to be able to come in and say, what are we missing, or where should we go next that we haven't thought about? And so, most of the time, you want to have some of those people obviously internal, but you need to sometimes get some of that outside opinion on getting that done. And that's where that adding people, either by hiring new people into the team or by partnering with others to add that expertise or the ideas over time. And funding, of course, research, no matter whether it's done in a university setting or in a production setting, it's expensive. There's no question. It costs money to collect research data. And so partnering with others allows us to spread those costs and leverage the expertise and resources, but all the research still costs money. And this is an area where there's the quest for dollars. You have to be careful, because we have some of you, I know, in the audience run for-profit research centers, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it's just knowing what the ultimate goal is. If you're in a production system, you want to limit the amount of your research that's really going for the for-profit side, because it's difficult to manage that long-term and keep the goals of your production system and the goals of your research profits on the same line, is at least what I've seen. Because when we do research as a profit center, the focus really changes to paying the bills and the salary rather than answering the most important questions. And again, that can be the goal of the system. It's just understanding what's your internal driven research and what's the external side. Because research gets driven by whoever brings the most dollars to the table. If you're a veterinarian, that's usually an animal health company. If you're a nutritionist, it's usually an ingredient supplier. And so that's who ends up usually driving what the trial is going to be. And there's sometimes pressure comes with that to compromise on either experimental design or the interpretation to satisfy the sponsor. And I can tell you, because I'm on the other side of that, and it's a continual battle that you have to make sure that you walk that line of doing the research with the credibility that you need to get the research done correctly and not design the experiments in order to show the response that somebody wants you to find with their product. So bottom line is, you need dollars to run the research program, but don't let the dollars drive your research program. And then the research mentality and commitment. Really, the biggest question is will the research get done according to protocol? And for me, almost every production system that I've looked at that has a successful research program, they got people in the upper level of management that believe in the research and believe in the importance of having that research program. If the system doesn't have that in the ownership or upper management, I would advise them not to do internal research, okay? Because I've worked with some systems that have not had that buy-in at the upper level, and what happens is you don't get the resources devoted towards it, you don't get the quality of people that you need, you compromise on design because of economics, and what happens is the data that comes out of it isn't worth anything, okay? And so you have to have that champion because the way we always do things will win out over that proper experimental design. And we've had to walk away from some production systems that built research barns that are beautiful barns, but we've had to walk away from working with them because they could not carry out the day-to-day research that needed. And that ties into that rigor of execution. Rigor in the protocol development, the design, the data capture, the analysis, and the interpretation. And the lack of discipline in any of those areas will lead to failure of repeatability results and failure of the research to have an impact in the field. And examples of lack of rigor, you could probably list hundreds of these, but some of the main ones we see is as allotting pigs as an example without balancing for some important things like genetic lines or gender or source farms or location in the barn, weighing on scales that haven't been calibrated, not validating pig counts and documenting removals. That's one that we think is, how hard is it to count 25 pigs in a pen? That's by far the most difficult thing we have with production systems if they don't have somebody that's checking the data on a regular basis when they collect it is pig counts. I mean, it's that, and when pigs get removed and they don't get accounted for. That's number one area where we struggle with quality of data if we don't have an ongoing feedback loop in the system. And weights are probably second, as problems with the scales. But counts is certainly number one. Not treating all the pigs on test in the same manner, not having the sufficient replication to draw conclusions. We see that, of course, all the time, concluding no response just because we don't have enough replication to actually find the response that we're trying to find. And then using the wrong statistical methods to analyze data. I'm not the statistician. I turn that over to Jordan Gephardt and our team. But that's an area I see in a lot of times that having the wrong methods analyzing the data, you can lead yourself to obviously very erroneous conclusions. So, and this one, the bottom line is lack of rigor means you get lack of trust in your data, which means you have lack of need for the researchers, whether that's at a university or whether that's in a production system. The peer review, this is one that, as I said, is hard to talk about on a production side because a lot of times we think about we can't share any of the data, or we don't want to share very much of the data externally because it's for that internal production system. But it's really critical to have some level of peer review for your system because it improves your process. You gain ideas from others to apply back to your system. I mean, we've published enough papers and know how frustrating the peer review process is. But it's also, I've learned a tremendous amount through the peer review process about things that we could improve on the way that we're doing our experiments and things that we need to improve on a day-to-day basis in order to answer some of those questions. Because it forces that rigor back into your process control. And this is where I think the internal opening things up, even if it's just internally within your production system, and having those critics internally to ask the hard questions, because you become too embarrassed not to have rigor when you expose your guts of your system to others. Okay? And it's needed for all research programs. And again, you can do that internally or externally. And then the other one I have down is credibility. Can your results be trusted by others? You have to build up that credibility. You don't have to have credibility to get funding. I mean, I think we all know of examples where you can point to somebody and say, well, they always get a positive response. And so you know there's some of those out there that you can always know that they're going to show the kind of response that is wanted, but it doesn't mean that that's replicable and you can get the same response elsewhere. Reasons for a lack of credibility is that lack of rigor in the experimental execution, and then the lack of openness in sharing of data. This is another one that I try to impress on, especially ingredient suppliers I work with. I trust working with products a lot better if you show me 8 trials, and it worked in 3 or 4 of them, but it didn't work in 4 or 5 of them, but you show me all the guts of it. You can help figure out and talk through, well, when is it working, when's it not working, what's going on? If you go the other side and you only show me the ones where it worked, and you don't show the other ones, and then when you have a trial that it doesn't show a response, then you start not believing the data, and you start trying to ask why are we not seeing all the information? And so, as university researchers, if our research is incredible, the producers will fail to gain benefit from our recommendations and will eventually lose their support. They won't work with us. Within a production system, if your research program loses credibility, the system will eventually ignore the research results and not implement them, and eventually it leads to lack of need for a research program in that production system. And so we've seen that happen in a few production systems where the research program has disappeared over time because it wasn't credible, and mostly it goes back to, again, the lack of rigor and support and upper level of the administration to support it. And then finally, of course, it starts and ends with people. And you've got to have good people that understand the importance of all these things, understand the importance of execution and carrying out the day-to-day activities in order to get the work done in the barns. And so it's one of those, we always joke about it with my colleagues and I that we can get up and show the results of a lot of research, but we know that it's the students and it's the workers in the barn, those that are out there in the barn on a day-to-day basis carrying out the research trials, that are the key to having any quality of information for us to share with anybody. And so just in summary, there's a number of things that have changed in the evolution of swine production research over time, but there's the very important things that haven't changed in terms of the importance of people, the funding, credibility, the quality control, and the data sharing. And I really like the way that Matt has this session set up to follow up with Dwight to show what they're doing on a research basis at Hordes, and then Aaron with some of the disease research. Shows you just some of the breadth of where this industry has gone in terms of collecting research data and applying it in production systems. With that, I'll turn things back to you, Matt. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mike. I think you did a great job of kind of highlighting where we've been, where we're going, and some of the opportunity that we have going forward. I'd echo your last slide, and it's all about the people. If you have the right people and you build a good research culture, you can have a lot of fun and get a lot of value for your production system. So thanks a lot, Mike. I think we have time for a couple questions. So I'll throw it out there first. Any questions from the group off the top here? All right, I got one, and then everybody else here can think for a while. Yeah. Mike, you kind of hit on there a little bit. There's been a lot of focus on mortality, removals, things like that. Have you seen anything or have any advice on better ways or different ways to answer some of those questions? Because as you noted, they can be pretty tough to answer in a lot of situations. Yeah, it's a good question. I think the biggest thing on mortality and removals is you need lots and lots of numbers, and you need lots of replication, and that can come in a few different ways. I mean, it can come within research barns or can come within production systems of applying research treatments across controlled barns while in that production system to build up replication that way. That's the only way I can see that we've made real significant progress in terms of looking at what happens when we apply a treatment to impact the mortality. I know Aaron's probably going to talk to us some about doing controlled challenge studies, and challenge studies a lot of times will give us ideas that we can then test out in the field, but we still got to get that replication out in the field in larger numbers of pigs that are under more natural field challenge to know how well it really works to solve the problem. Right. Yep. Thanks, Mike. We got one here.
Some of the questions for the industry.
Yep. Yeah, John asked about that, the future of the industry in terms of what's needed in terms of research. Well, I think we've got enough research barns, I'll be honest. I think we have enough research barns in the United States today. Some of them probably need to be retooled or replaced to answer some of the larger number questions that we have. But I do think that some coordination would be very helpful in our industry. What I see is we have an awful lot of people that are answering the same questions or very similar questions over again, and that's one of the areas where I think we have redundancy of use of our information. We've tried numerous times to get some of the questions answered. Well, it'd be a great example with your company is answering, vitamin questions. How much vitamins do we need to put in a grow finish diet, and how do you answer that question when we know that it's very difficult to find a response in one research barn. And that's a kind of trial that you got to do across a number of different systems to try to get an answer to. And that kind of trial has been difficult to get set up and executed. So I think some of that kind of cooperation is where I would really like to see some things going in the future. Yeah.
You stole my question, but I want to go further on that. In terms of future, in the Canadian government, I see that now they're hiring less and less scientists who know animal science. And I'm asking, in the future, does that mean that most of the animal science-based research will be done in commercial settings? Yeah. And is it the same in the States?
Yes. I mean, the answer to your question is yes. Most of the practical applied research is going to be done in commercial settings. My worry about that, and this is what and I'm happy to see there's a number. when I talked in 2010, there were really, I think, 2 universities in the U.S. that were actively engaged in an ongoing research programs in the field. Now I think there's 8 in the U.S. that have some kind of relationship with the production system to put their graduate students into those situations. And some of those are very formal and some are very informal, but getting them that training, because one of my long-term concerns is how do you train people to do production research and to be involved with overseeing production research if they're trained only in basic sciences and then they go out and they have to be in charge of a production research program if they've never had any experience in it. And that is one of the concerns is how we maintain that training of the future generations to keep that research going. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Mike. With that, we'll wrap up and we'll head on to the next session. Let's give Mike a round of applause, please.